As we approach the end of summer in 2014, the S&P 500 just passed the 2000 mark in what CNBC called the most hated stock market rally in years, back in September 2012 already. Because at the same time, we hear an increasing outcry about growing inequality, the 1% versus the 99%, with the share of income going to the top 1% now reaching new highs to levels last seen before the Great Depression here in the 1930s. In November 2013, Pope Francis called for a resolve to what he called the tyranny of capitalism, which he said is leading to widespread social unrest due to inordinate consumption and unbridled consumerism. We have also seen an increase in global tension since the financial crisis of 2008, first with the Occupy Wall Street movement, followed by the Arab Spring and now the ISIS movement spreading across many countries in the Middle East and North Africa, with frequent media discussion about a return to Cold War era and even talk of World War III. So what is at the root of this growing inequality and tensions? Those are the questions we want to address in this video. How bad can it get, and is there a peaceful solution to it all? As Sir Isaac Newton said in 1676, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Let's see if we can learn from some of the giants of the past to better understand what the future holds for us. The first giant I want to call on is Ayn Rand, who wrote the book Atlas Shrugged in 1957, a book which has surprised many by making Amazon's top seller list after the 2009 financial crisis. She writes, "So you think that money is the root of all evil? Have you ever asked yourself, what is the root of money?" She goes on to explain how money and wealth is the product of man's capacity to think, each of us to the extent of our own ability, the able at the expense of the incompetent and the ambitious at the expense of the lazy. Money is made possible only by the men who produce, she writes. Is this what you consider evil? When you see money flowing to those who deal not in goods but in favors, and your laws don't protect you against them but protect them against you, when you see corruption being rewarded and honesty becoming a self-sacrifice, you may know that your society is doomed. Run for your life from any man who tells you that money is evil. So is money or capitalism then really to blame or not? Ayn Rand's arguments reminds us of the fundamental differences between the competing philosophies of Marxism, socialism, communism, and capitalism, arguments that go way back to 1840s when Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto and argued that over time a capitalist system will cause rising inequality as wealth is collected by the bourgeoisie, the 1%, until unavoidable social unrest will happen by the proletariat, or the 99%. So according to Marx, capitalism will naturally evolve into socialism, then permanently into communism. Marx's argument is essentially one of, on the one hand, freedom, popular actions, giving people what they want, versus on the other side, control, central, disciplined actions, driving performance based on rules and giving people what they need. But why do we see the same discussion starting to emerge again today? That is what Russian economist Nikolai Kondratiev also asked in the 1920s when he came up with a market cycle theory which contradicted Karl Marx's theory of linear progression towards communism and the imminent collapse of capitalism. Today known as the Kondratiev or K-wave cycle, this cycle lasts for 54 years on average and is linked not only to stock market cycles but more to interest rate or treasury bond cycles, with a spring phase where capital goods investment and return on investment is strong, a summer phase where the economy overheats, where we see inflation and when there is a primary recession, a collapse in the stock markets, then an autumn phase where there is strong growth in the economy associated with credit being extended, and then a winter phase where return on investment plummets and where interest rates turn into deflation. Kondratiev also made an important link to wars during the winter and spring phases of his cycle. He was not the first one to talk about these long-term cycles. As we now go back in time to review the history of cycles, we will see a clear pattern emerge. Each empire that was dominant had a distinct competitive advantage. They reached a peak in their civilization when they lost most of that advantage. That was followed by a period of debasement of their currency or their coins associated with wars, and then followed by another empire taking over or another reserve currency being established. Let's now follow these cycles by following the dominant coins or currency of each era. So this chart shows around the year 3500 BC, the cradle of civilization, as it is called, where 6 independent civilizations emerged after the Ice Age. The first competitive advantage we find is in Mesopotamia, right here, where we first learned how to write. Then going to 3100 BC, we find the first recorded use of money here in the Nile Valley, where 1 part of gold was valued at 2.5 parts of silver. Then going to 1406 BC, we have what looks like the first recorded market cycle. It's found in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 10, essentially saying that every 50 years all property must be returned to the original owners and slaves must be returned to their families. This hardly looks like the celebration it is stated to be. If we imagine 50 years, that's about between 2 and 3 generations. That all the property in slaves that we collect over that time must just be given up voluntarily. To me, this looks much more like the first record of a natural economic market cycle or a collapse. And we also find this Jubilee cycle in the independent civilization of the Mayans here in Mesoamerica across the Atlantic Ocean, where they have a similar 52-year Jubilee cycle. Now, if we count ahead exactly 17 Hebrew Jubilee cycles, we come to Ezekiel's Jubilee in the year 573 BC, when the first gold coin was minted, the Lydia coin, in the area where Greece and Turkey are today, which was then the Greek Empire. What was their competitive advantage? Well, the superior fleet of trading ships. They were eventually challenged by surrounding powers like Sparta and forced to debase their currency by mixing it with copper, until it was 100% copper coins at the time of the Peloponnesian War with Sparta in 404 BC, which they lost, and causing the fall of Athens and the fall of the Greek Empire, during which 2/3 of the people of Athens died. The next dominant coin was the silver denarius minted by the Roman Republic, later known as the Roman Empire. This would follow the same pattern. The denarius was debased until less than 5% fineness. This led to the split of the Roman Empire into the East and West empires during the imperial crisis in the year 274. The next dominant coin was the gold solidus minted by the Eastern Roman Empire, which later became known as the Byzantine Empire. This empire lost most of its competitive advantage during many military disasters and civil wars, during which the solidus was debased to contain only 15% gold in the year 1092. This was followed by the Hyperpyron coin, which was debased from 24 carats to 12 carats, and the empire lost most of its territory around the Mediterranean Sea until only the modern-day Turkey remained. These Byzantine Empire coins were followed by the florin and the ducat coins to be the dominant trading currency, minted by 2 separate Italian kingdoms, one in Florence and one in Venice. These coins were never debased, but their value deteriorated over time from 1 lira to 7 lira by the year 1500. So at this point, we start having good market data. This is not stock market data, but a simple price index, which Kondratiev used for his market cycle theories. And you can clearly see the peaks and the troughs in the markets over time. In the late 1400s, the Portuguese real became the dominant reserve currency in the world. Their competitive advantage was also their naval fleet, which could reach distant worlds, such as the Ivory Coast in 1471, which gave the Portuguese access to gold at the time when Europe's gold sources were scarce. They lost their advantage during the succession crisis in 1580, which resulted in the Iberian Union with Spain. So the Spanish Empire and their pieces of 8 silver coins shown here was the next dominant reserve currency. During this time, the Pope divided the world into 2 parts, one to be explored by the Spanish and one by the Portuguese. So they basically had a trading monopoly on these new worlds to be discovered, which was a significant advantage. Spain eventually lost this advantage due to excessive debt, many debt defaults, and eventually losing the 30-year war with many European countries, including the Dutch, a war during which 8 million people died. So the guilder minted by the Dutch Empire became the next dominant coin and reserve currency. Again, their competitive advantage was their fleet of trading ships, organized under a state capitalist system with strong companies such as the Dutch East India Company dominating trade routes to the spices in the east. This model was copied by France and Britain around the same time, and it's interesting to note the high level of debasement of coins during this 30-year war that raged across Europe, known as the Kipper and Whipper era in Germany for their use of tipping scales to distinguish debased coins from good ones. This debasement in the early 1620s led to the first recorded market bubble, the tulip bubble in Amsterdam or in Holland, here in 1633 to 37. The Dutch lost most of their dominance during 4 Anglo-Dutch wars leading up to 1789. But before that, in 1718, John Law founded the Royal Bank of France and heavily debased the franc by printing banknotes for the first record of fractional reserve banking. This led to the Mississippi Company and South Sea Company bubbles collapsing around the same time in the mid-1720s. The culture of debasement during these times led to a long period of wars and protests, ending in the French Revolution in 1789 and the Revolutionary Wars that followed, after which France and their 5-franc coin became the dominant reserve currency. This first French Empire, or the Napoleonic Empire as it is known, was based on the very unique competitive advantage that brought Napoleon to power, his way of warfare and the concept that a war must pay for itself, leading an angry and desperate nation to invade most of the European countries around them. The 5-franc coin was never debased during his reign, but budget deficits eventually led to the devaluation of the coin as Napoleon overextended himself while invading Russia, ending in the famous Battle of Waterloo. 6.5 million people died during the Napoleonic Wars. Next, the British Empire came to be the dominant reserve currency with their pound sterling. The Bank of England reset the gold standard in 1816 and launched a massive recoinage program in 1821. British dominance lasted until 1895 when an arms race with Germany started, leading to World War I when Germany left the gold standard in 1914. Britain would lose most of its global power, going from being responsible for 40% of the world's foreign investment before World War I to a debt of £850 million after the war. This contractive cycle continued into World War II. 18 million people died during World War I and 73 million people died during World War II. So the US dollar became the world's reserve currency. The competitive advantage was gold received during both world wars for the assistance the US gave other European countries, and also for the fact that US assets were not as significantly destroyed during these wars. The US dollar became the official reserve currency with the signing of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1945, which made it the anchor currency and the gold standard for other international currencies. This dominance was lost when President Richard Nixon took the US and the whole world off the gold standard in 1971. And since then, the US went from zero debt and a current account surplus to government debt of over $17 trillion and consistent current account and budget deficits. If we now look at equity or stock market prices for the first time, we see a clear reflection of the mood of the markets during each Kondratiev cycle. Here in 1837, Hans Christian Andersen, another giant, wrote the children's tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, where it took a child to point out to the adults that the emperor was naked. And Charles Mackay wrote his classic book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, right here in the bottom of this market collapse in 1841, at the bottom of the Kondratiev winter cycle. Clearly, this was a time of mass delusion, as this was the second largest market collapse of all time. You will see, as this is a logarithmic chart, the size of the collapse down here in percentage terms is the same as the other market collapses you see on other points in the chart, and it's only trumped by the Great Depression's collapse in the early 1930s. Nikolai Kondratiev developed his market cycle theory here during the autumn and winter of this Kondratiev cycle in the 1920s, but he was executed by firing squad here in 1938, as his ideas that Marx was wrong were obviously not very popular with the Joseph Stalin regime, and the mood of the market was clearly very depressed. Also Gandhi, who did remarkable work in his country, a giant in his country, India, during World War II, by reconciling the Hindu and the Muslim people, was eventually shot here in 1948, right at the bottom of the Kondratiev winter cycle. John Lennon wrote the song Imagine here in 1971, the same time that Nixon took the world off the gold standard and extended a very unpopular war in Vietnam for another 3 years. John Lennon also wrote the song Give Peace a Chance during this time, but he was shot in 1980 at the bottom of this primary recession and low in the markets during this time. When I look at this cycle, I look at what is my age when the cycle was last at bargain levels. And I see I was still in high school during the early 80s when this cycle was last in bargain territory. This is the bargain line. This is the expensive line. So I was still in high school. My dad will probably remember this much better, but even my dad was only born in 1938. He will not even remember very well all the atrocities during this winter phase of the Kondratiev cycle. Warren Buffett talks in his book, The Snowball, about as a kid when he visited his dad's office, how negative the traders were. So he remembered some of the negativity of this era. But it looks like these cycles exist because of the duration it takes the human race to forget the past. It takes us 2 or 3 generations before we forget what we did in the past and then we repeat it. It may be as simple as that. So with each cycle comes massive destruction. Most of all, the loss of human lives. This is clearly not very intelligent of us as a human race to repeat this destructive cycle every 50 to 60 years. Or are these cycles required to bring the level of adversity that is required for the evolution of the human race, as Charles Darwin argued? Maybe, but it is clear to me that there's a large part of this cycle that is not natural, that is caused by our failure to manage this process. So how bad will it get? Well, we get off the gold standard year in 1971. So this red piece can be seen as the unsustainable part of the cycle, which, as we see in the past, is often completely given back. A collapse to the bottom of this red section will take us to a S&P 500 level of between 100 and 300 points. You may remember that we did reach 666 points in 2009 briefly, and it will take us to a price earnings level of 5, and not quickly down to that level and back as in 2009, but for a period of about 10 years, as we saw here in the 30s and 40s. I do not think we can imagine the level of anger, protesting, and finger-pointing that will erupt if this is about to happen again. But look at the History Channel will give us a pretty good idea of the mood the last time this happened in the 40s and 50s. This is probably why Einstein said, "I do not know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." To fully understand why Kondratiev made the connection with wars, we can use the cycle of deflation put together by Comstock Partners, and to which I added the links to the gold standard and wars. Each time we start with a competitive advantage, followed by savings and investment, but then we start feeling pressure to go off the gold standard. And it should then be clear that we have lost our competitive advantage. We are no longer producing more than what we are getting from other nations, or we are spending more than we are making. If we continue to invest, we will just build excess capacity and be forced to go down a vicious cycle leading to plant closings and debt defaults. This is when unemployment is out of control and when the pitchforks come out and when people take to the streets and mass riots. And under these circumstances, it is very easy for the government of the day to give people a war, giving them jobs, building weapons to fight some distant nation who had nothing to do with the problems leading up to the war in the first place. And that is why I claim that the decision to leave the gold standard is 100% responsible for the wars that are guaranteed to follow many years later. So which metrics can be used to tell where we are in this cycle? Well, two metrics. Number one is the credit market debt to GDP, which reached 360% in the US in 2008. And we have since climbed back to this level. So we are still right at the top of the cycle. During the last Kondratiev winter, this ratio dropped down to 130%. So at least 2/3 of all debt need to magically disappear for us to reach the bottom of the cycle again, giving us an idea of the magnitude of the problems ahead. The second metric, the price earnings 10 ratio, this just spreads the running average of 10 years for the earnings to take some of the fluctuation out of it. But we are now at the second highest point on record, only trumped by the valuations during the tech bubble, which is part of the same Kondratiev cycle. So we're right at the top and still climbing upwards. As we saw, this ratio dropped from 26.6, where we are at the moment, to below 6 price earnings level for a period of close to 10 years before a sustainable Kondratiev spring recovery can start. It should be clear that both these two metrics tell us where we are in the cycle, but they can be manipulated by debasement and stimulus, which is going on at the moment. The metrics which will give us a clear picture of a nation's competitiveness are its current account surplus, to show if there is a net demand for a nation's products and services from other countries, and its level of government debt and foreign reserves. So we see that we tend to go out of balance during the good times by giving people too much freedom, while we should have used a more disciplined approach. But let's think about it some more. What would have happened if Nixon did not take us off the gold standard? Here we see the diagram that we just saw in the historic cycles. We have a competitive advantage, we reach a peak, and then we tend to go for the popular option most of the time, leaving the gold standard or debasing our coins, using stimulus, printing fiat currency, which leads to wars. What would have happened if Richard Nixon did not do that and went for a disciplined approach by forcing us to regain a balanced budget, regaining our competitiveness, driving innovation, which would have led to a sustainable economy? Well, if we think about it, if Richard Nixon did not do the popular thing, someone else would have offered it to the people. His opponent during the next election would have offered it. So we see in a democratic system, it is politically impossible to make an unpopular choice, because your competitor will always simply offer the popular choice and take your seat away. So this highlights a big systemic flaw in our system of government. It's easy to make these disciplined decisions later on in the cycle when the pitchforks come out. Then the people will demand it and government can do them. But to do them at a time when we need to do them, that is politically impossible. The Fed cannot do it either, the Federal Reserve. Alan Greenspan to this day believes that bubbles are an inherent part of human behavior. So we have a difficult choice ahead. We now understand that the 1% will never solve this dilemma. They cannot. They're in between a rock and a hard place. It will be up to the 99% to do it. So here we can climb on the shoulders of giant Albert Einstein again, because we need to ask ourselves, how can we find a simple solution to a complex problem? And that is what he showed us. When there's a complex problem, there must be a simple solution. So if we simply ask ourselves, what is the thing that disturbs us most about these 50-year cycles that we keep on repeating? Is it the loss of and the destruction of the property and our cities during these wars? That's a big part of it. But clearly it is the destruction of human lives, the loss of millions of people, and the barbaric way in which we kill each other during these cycles that disturbs us most. So obviously there's a major misalignment on a government level between the freedom and the popular actions we are forced to do during good times and the performance and the discipline we are later forced to do. So by asking these questions, we can start to imagine a future state where all nations voluntarily give up their right to war and only have police forces. And only the United Nations has the right to use war to enforce rules. In this way, all nations will compete only economically. If we can achieve that, we have broken most of this destructive cycle. But how to get there? Step one will have to be get off the currency grid. The US dollar and most other international fiat currencies, that means paper currencies, are too far debased to be saved. The 1% will be forced to stretch inequality, debt, and the debasement through QE and stimulus programs until some breaking point. You have to sell all your currency, all your fiat currency and paper assets. That means all your stock exchange assets, including your 401k or your retirement account assets, and not only convert it into cash, because cash is still fiat currency. You have to convert it into some physical assets, either gold or a physical asset that can be traded for value in the future. Because keeping your retirement account in fiat currency, as you saw in the charts, will be next to nothing before you retire. So you have to get out at the top now, or wait for the bottom and blame only yourself. You cannot later say, I knew this could not last, as many people are already saying today. You have to call the emperor naked now, and this is step one. Step two is join the peaceful call for a constitutional convention. Why? Well, who gave our government the right to war, as we asked before? If I look at the Constitution here in the United States, it starts with we the people. So we the people gave our government the rights it has, and only we the people can take them away. So understanding that, we can now start planning what are the demands we need to push for in the next constitutional convention. Clearly, number one is politicians should not be allowed to leave the gold standard or go on extraordinary popular delusions, QE, stimulus, these type of programs, however popular they are, even if they can get the votes for them. We, the people, must establish a neutral authority with hard rules to protect ourselves and future generations from this dynamic. Only the United Nations must have that power. Then we must agree on national limits to current account deficits, debt, and reserves, followed by a certain grace period, almost like a forbearance period in a loan. If you don't pay your mortgage for a while, there will be a certain period given by the bank for you to catch up, and that will be followed by bankruptcy. We already have bankruptcy proceedings for individuals, Chapter 13 here in the US, Chapter 11 for companies, Chapter 9 for municipalities or cities, but now we need bankruptcy proceeding for nations. But we have to do it without giving the House of Representatives or the Senate or the leaders of the government the right to vote, because this will not allow the emergency manager to make the unpopular adjustments necessary to bring the balance back in the economy. Our leaders must know that If they cannot reach agreement on how to balance the freedom and the popular actions with the discipline or performance of the nation to compete with other nations, someone else, an emergency manager, will be put in place to do it for them. And that will solve a lot of the standoff that we have at the moment. Sovereign nations also need to give up their right to build weapons or armies and only have police forces. Only the United Nations will have armed forces to enforce the rules across the world. And we, as the 99%, must resist any military or religious solutions. The 99%, we must remember, includes all countries, all religions, Islam and Christianity, and all races across the world. No wars are possible if the 99% simply refuse to build weapons or to simply refuse to use the weapons that exist already. This will not be easy because it's not in the interest of the 1%. Just think of how long it took us to abolish slavery in the world. This was something that took us centuries to do because this was also not in the interest of the 1%. So this will be an uphill battle. The 99% will have to sacrifice a lot. But this is the next level that will take humanity in the right direction. This has been tried many times before, so we need to be aware. In 1825, the Bank of England repealed the Bubble Act of 1720s. Remember, in the 1720s, it was the Mississippi Company bubble and the South Sea Company bubble that burst. The Bubble Act was implemented then, but just repealed 105 years later, leading to 1837 bubble that we saw, during which Hans Christian Andersen and Charles Mackay wrote their books. So step 3, while this constitutional convention of step 2 is on the go, this might take a while. You can start now by addressing the inequality in the world through your company, one company at a time. My book, The Forces of Progress, show how any one company can convert to what I call capitalism for the 100% today in any nation around the world. So just imagine how we will one day tell our children of the distant times when we were still allowing our countries and governments to go on extraordinary popular delusions, followed by spending millions on weapons to kill millions of innocent people, and how we the people put a stop to this barbaric cycle. So take step 1, get off the currency grid, and then reply, "I'm off," below this video once you have done it. All the best.